It's another precinct heard from in France's blowback against inequality. After the Yellow Vest movement, ahead of December 5th mass strikes against pension reform, university students this Tuesday mobilizing. The recent self-immolation outside of a student union building in Lyon of a 22-year-old political science major, drawing attention to the desperate means of those squeezed by stagnating scholarship stipends, rising rent, and soaring cost of living. Are we back to 1 year ago when the president was accused of being too out of touch with reality when it came to these social concerns? Emmanuel Macron never attended university. His formative years included highly selective preparatory schools and what's known here as la voie royale, the royal path, those elitist grande école schools. Over in the UK, that's a familiar tale where the resentment against Oxford and Cambridge is growing, and currently teachers and staff at 60 universities are on strike. Over the years, their wages have stagnated while the cost of living has gone up. How does the state make quality education affordable? In a changing workforce where the demand for unskilled labor is plummeting, how does a scaled-back welfare state stop those entering that changing workforce from getting left behind? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at that growing pauperisation of some students. And with us to talk about it, Titouan Martin-Barre. He's a student at the University of Rennes, senior member of the FAGE, the Federation of Student Associations.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting us.
We're also pleased to welcome Alexandre Omis, director of the Versailles branch of the administrative services body, the CRUS. In a word, what does the CRUS do?
We take care of student grants, student housing, and student catering for the entire western part of Paris.
All right, for the whole western part of Paris.
Thanks for having me, by the way.
Yeah. Florian Berco is a member of Franco-British Connections. What's Franco-British Connections?
It's an association for students and young professionals to create links between France and the UK.
All right, well, let's go to the UK. From Oxford, England, we're joined by Andy Green, Professor of Comparative Social Science at the University of College London Institute of Education and the author of The Crisis for Young People, Generational Inequalities in Education, Work, Housing, and Welfare. So thank you for being with us.
Hello, good evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yes, students rallying this Tuesday on several campuses across the country to draw attention to this pauperisation of those who come from underprivileged backgrounds. James Wilson has more.
On the 8th of November, a young student walked into the centre of Lyon and set himself on fire. A desperate act to draw attention to the plight of those students living in poverty. And it's lit the fuse of a nationwide campaign.
It's not normal that students have to take such extreme actions to make people aware of this absurd system, a system that's harming students and that's degrading to their existence.
It's hard to find accommodation, buy food, and even to study. Just under 4 in 10 students get help from the French government, but student unions say this isn't enough and that the whole system needs to be reformed, taking greater account of the cost of living. On a visit to his hometown of Amiens, President Macron acknowledged that many students are struggling.
We have been reminded of just how difficult student life can be, the difficulties of our young people face when they study and work, how it makes them doubt the future.
So far, however, the French government has yet to propose any new student-specific measures. If nothing is done, student groups will likely join other protest movements for a day of demonstrations planned for next week.
Tuesday's protests allowed us to begin a discussion. Now the movement needs to grow. Groups need to get together. We're calling for street demonstrations on the 5th of December.
Student unions estimate that 20% of 18 to 24-year-olds live below the poverty line.
So as we heard in that report, Titouan Martin-Barre, 4 out of 10 students in France get either a scholarship or some form of stipend or help from the government. How many, though, are in what we could call a dire situation, the kind that would lead you to do what that student did in Lyon back on the 8th?
Hopefully there's like no student living the same thing. However, when you're on this field, you realize that there is like many people, around 20% living under the poverty line, which is huge. The government is helping, but it's not helping enough.
Not helping enough. And, you know, how do you go about it? Because what'll be for you the important call on the 5th of December? Because they're going to be striking about pensions that day.
Yeah, the call on the 5th, FAGE is not calling to go on strike on the 5th because it's mainly about like retirement. And even though we are going to also talk about like students' poverty, we don't call on the 5th. We call to make actions on the 26th, so today. And many of our local organizations took actions and try like to sensitize people and like prevent poverty and try like to prevent these kind of events.
Is this an isolated case, or is this a bellwether, what happened with this student in Lyon, Alexandre Omis?
Hopefully it is, and it's going to stay isolated. What we're trying to do every day is trying to make sure that this situation doesn't happen again. And there were a few protests today in about 10 cities, and the main thing they're asking for is increased scholarships, make sure that scholarships are delivered on time, and do something with housing, because housing is half the budget of a student, and if housing prices increase by 10% every year, by 2021, there'll be it'll be a lot harder for students to get housing accommodation anywhere in France.
Yeah, the main cost of when you ask students what their main cost is in their budget, it is rent, particularly in the bigger cities where they're at university. This in a country where there's less student housing and accommodation than in many neighboring European countries. You see, this is a breakdown that was done by the Observatoire de la Vie Étudiante in 2016. Childcare, there are parents there are mature students who have children.
Very few, fortunately.
It's 2%. It's very few, but of course the cost is big for them. But that problem of housing. In the UK, only the first-year students, right, live on campus for the most part. And then afterwards, but they do get help from the university in finding accommodation. Could that system be replicated
It's
here?
actually being experimented in Saclay right now, because when those establishments were asked to move to Saclay a few years ago, they mentioned that in order to attract students, including international students, to somewhere where there was nothing like back 10 years ago, you need to provide housing like massively for everyone to come. So first-year students in that part of the region are located and have housing available at the feet of the schools. And that should be spread like France, all over France. But it's a process. It takes a long time. We've been playing catch-up for the past 20 years on the housing situation, because in the mid-'80s, the student population like doubled, and we had to play catch-up ever since.
It doubled, and right now there's something of a baby boom. There were a lot of children born in France in 2000.
Yeah.
How are
We
you
predict
coping?
that in the next 5 to 10 years, the student population is going to be increasing by between 3 and 5%. So what we're dealing with today is going to be probably even worse in the next 5 years, which is why the government launched a plan for increasing student housing over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, which the intent is to build between 40 and 60,000 student accommodations more than what we have today.
Florent Berco, the French, when it comes to reform, it's sometimes slow. With what you just heard there, and when you think about neighboring countries, what can be done now, fast?
I would say before that it's a political issue, this act from the students, and the main figures is, of course, in 30 years, so the number of students doubled, but it's the same in other countries like in the UK or in Germany. We see in these two countries a dual educational system. We see private school competing with public schools and public universities. We see elitism growing, and the poor student growing also. So we need a political reaction. And what is interesting in the government of Macron is that it seems that youth is not its priority. So we can ask him why he doesn't want to invest in his youth.
Well, you say that youth is not the priority. Today was opening day of France's big national food bank. 900,000 citizens in this country rely on what we call here les restos du cœur for meals. A population that's getting younger and younger, say organizers. 24,000 of those who go regularly to those food banks are now students, says the organization. The health minister says, contrary to what you heard from Florian, that the government is on it.
Regarding students, we've cancelled students' social security, so they won't need to pay those extra €217 each year. That means extra money for every student. Additionally, Frédéric Vidal, the Minister for Higher Education, Research and Innovation, is setting up campuses that deliver better access to healthcare. We're currently building free and accessible health centres for all students on campuses.
So there's your answer, Florian Berco.
Yeah, but the question is how they help the poorer students in this situation to increase their lives. So we need to work on housing. It's one henna, and we need also to help them.
How do you work on housing? Because we've been talking about the housing crunch in lots of shows here, and you can't regulate rents. What can you do?
No, but you can also have a structural reform and where you put students, because we see a concentration of students in big cities, Lyon, Marseille, Lille, Nantes, Paris. Why not putting university in smaller cities, in more rural territories also, and help them to host students? So we can have education all over the territories, because the problem of housing is that we see students going out of their houses, of their family, to go to another city to study. That's an issue also.
All right, lots of reactions on the hashtag F24 debate, including this one from the UK, where it seems as though it's the same issues. Today I joined the union and striked. Only by organizing and fighting together, my generation can come out of the trap of temporary contracts, burnout, expensive housing, and low wages. This is that strike that's going on in the UK. Andy Green, are you on strike?
Yeah, we're on strike. A large proportion of the university staff across England are on strike.
And
this is a strike about the erosion of...
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, it's a strike about strike about many things. It's a strike about the erosion of pensions. It's about the growing number of staff on precarious contracts, very high proportion now. It's about the continuing gender pay gap. There's a whole cluster of issues here, and the staff are on strike and also supported by students in many cases.
Are you surprised to hear about this pauperisation, if you will, of a certain amount of the students, 1 in 5, according to Titouan sitting here on set, here in France, how the inequality is growing among the student body?
I'm not surprised. It takes a slightly different form in England, but young people in general are suffering in terms of their living standards. There's no doubt about that. Students are in a slightly different position in England because although they pay very high fees, home and EU students are paying over £9,000 a year, international students twice that. They are getting government-backed loans to cover their fees and to cover to contribute towards their living costs. So these students are graduating with huge debts, about £50,000 worth of debt, but they have quite a long time to pay it off, and frankly, most of them.
I'm gonna have to interrupt you for a second there, Andy, because we're having issues with the sound. We're gonna try to fix those as soon as possible. So some overlapping issues. I'm gonna turn to you, Florian, because this is what you've worked on. There are common themes, but it is different in France. Explaining.
Yeah, it's different causes and maybe not the same history. So in France, we have a history of centralization in main cities and a strong university that competes themselves between themselves, and we work differently. We have a competition, huge competition between grandes écoles and university, and not the same budget put in, because you have more of private money and on the grandes écoles and more of public subsidies for universities. It's not the same in the UK because you have private money everywhere and you have competition with all the universities and public universities. So it's not exactly the same.
Alexandre Miss, somebody who does your job in the US or in the UK, they complain that basically they're a fundraiser most of the time. Is that what you do?
I wouldn't say that. In addition to scholarships, we have emergency funds, which are used for treating cases like the one we have to deal with in Lyon, which means that if a student has gone out of the system because he cannot get a scholarship because he's been studying for too long, for example, he can still ask us to get a little piece of that emergency fund to help him. So we have a wide variety of solutions that we need to put together to make sure that everybody knows about them, because the problem we're facing today is that there's a lot that's being done, but all students don't know about what's being done. And sometimes they just need the right person to put them through to the right person to help them. So we need to find a way to spread that information, knowing that today social media and email are just a whole mess, and that make information just get lost in all that's being spread in the media or in the news or via social media. So we need to find a way to touch everyone, to spread that information, and find a way to help everyone.
Find a way to help everyone. Do you get the sense, do you agree with that? There's a communication problem?
I agree. There's a big communication problem. There's like 50 million left on the emergency fund. So yeah, a big communication problem, but that's really not the only problem. The main fund for grants is not enough and needs to be reformed. We calculate at FAGE every year for several years now the coût de la rentrée, the cost for every beginning
back
of
to
school
school
year. Yeah, back to school a fee and price, and it's raising. Sometimes it's going down, but it's raising overall. So it's getting bigger, and like funds are not getting bigger.
All right, is it part of a bigger problem, which is, a sort of a disengagement, if you will, of the welfare state? We'll ask our panel when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the precarious condition that more and more young people are in particular, university students. We're talking about it with Titouan Martin Barré, who is from the National Association in France of Student Groups, the FAGE. Or do you say FAGE? Which do you say?
You can say FAGE.
You can say FAGE. There you go. All right.
Say FAGE.
Alexandre Miss is with the CRUS, and their branch, and that's based in Versailles. That's in the western suburbs of Paris. The CRUS is the Regional Center for University Services. Florian Berco, an entrepreneur and a member of the Franco-British Connections, which brings together students from across the channel. And Andy Green teaches comparative social science at the University of College London Institute of Education, is with us from Oxford, the author of The Crisis for Young People, Generational Inequalities in Education, Work, Housing and Welfare. You were telling us just before the break about those strikes that have been taking place where you are. Tuition there, multiples of what it is in France. Wages for teachers in the UK have not followed, hence that strike. And it's this more seminal question, Andy, which is the welfare state. We've been chipping away at it for a long time. Is it mission impossible reversing the growing inequality we're seeing and that's playing out in what we described in part one of our discussion?
Well, I think the growing inequalities between generations, which we're focusing on to some extent here, is being driven by problems in the welfare state due to the aging of populations. It's very, very simple. Healthcare and social care for increasingly large retired populations is funded and increasingly will be funded out of the taxes of younger working people. There's also been a rise of precarious work, which is driven, I suppose, by globalization, the particular form of globalization, the neoliberal form which dominates. And this is affecting a very large proportion of young people. They're in the front line. So probably 30% of young people under 30 are, if they're working, are in precarious jobs, short-term contracts, insecure employment, agency work, work of what we call 0 hours contract,
And
where you
what's
don't know
the
how many hours you'll have next week.
what's the mindset among university students today? What are they hoping to achieve from that education that they're getting?
Well, I think in some ways, undergraduates are more optimistic while they're still on their courses than they become afterwards. They are facing quite high rents and rising rents, but there are government-backed loans which are paying the fees to begin with. These have to be paid back, and the young people graduate with very high levels of debt. The real problems, I think, occur for young graduates when they're out in the labor market and they find it very hard to get work which is commensurate with their qualifications. So probably 30%, even 10 years later, are not doing what you'd call graduate jobs. They're working in jobs that don't require all the skills that they've gained whilst they're in university. And this, for a proportion of young people, about a third perhaps, who of graduates, the prospects in the employment market are not very good. But there's also very increasing, very sharp inequality within generations. So, young people who've been to the best universities on courses which have a large wage return in the labor market are still doing okay. It's the third of young people who don't have degrees or who have degrees from universities which don't have much prestige in the labor market. This group of young people is losing out considerably, and their standards of living relative to previous generations are dropping.
Alexandre Miss, your reaction to that, you sometimes say to yourself, well, A, perhaps we're teaching the wrong stuff, and B, what do we do about the dual track system between, on the one hand, these elitist grandes écoles where you're guaranteed a great job for life practically, and the rest of the universities here in France?
If you look at what's been happening in the past few years, there's been an increasing access to higher education, which is in itself a good news. And there's been a lot of companies, like private companies and big companies, asking for students that are better trained than they were like back 20 years ago. And this is why the government is making a big focus on what we call apprentissage, which is
apprenticeships,
which is basically saying study a little bit, but also learn to work at the same time, so that when you get to the job market, you're ready for what's waiting for you. And that's all that is good news. And I don't believe that we're not teaching the right stuff. We've been teaching the right stuff. And if you look at investments in higher education in the past 10 years, they've grown exponentially, not only for education in itself, but also for infrastructure. There's been a lot of money put into renovating campuses, into constructing new campuses. We were mentioning earlier that some small cities need infrastructures for EUT, what we call EUT, which is basically short training, and this has been done for the past 10 years, like it's never been done before. So we're on the right path, but we're still playing catch up, as I was saying in my introduction. We're playing catch up because this number of students it keeps increasing, and there's no stopping it.
By the way, University of Rennes, where you are, Titouan, it ticks a lot of those boxes, right? Decentralized, the way Florian likes it. It's not in one of those big cities. It's a tech hub. The campus life there has been developed. There's good public transport.
Yeah.
Is that the exception?
Basically, University of Rennes has got an antenna, or like a delocalized campus in Saint-Brieuc. And both of these campuses are not enough to take every student that want to study in the field of sport, because that's what I'm studying right now, STAPS. It's not enough. And we've been trying to help people find some places to learn in universities, and sometimes we run out of places, and then those people go to those private schools like that cost 6,000, 10,000, 12,000 euros a year. So yeah, we've been playing catch up because the number of students wants to increase, but the number of places in the universities doesn't, or at least not enough.
Do you agree with the part of what Alexandre Remy said, that we are training students better than we were? They do have more opportunities thanks to the education that's offered?
I think so. I think so. According to the number, the employment number is like really really big, especially like at students in universities after a master's degree, or sometimes a bachelor's degrees. It's like really high, so it's a good thing.
But you have to stay in the system, and for those who are at the lower end of the social scale, that's tough.
Obviously, for instance, you don't have enough money to move around and like go to another cities because you can't live on your own. You have to live with your parents. If the universities from your town says no and says I don't want you because I don't have enough spaces, well, you need to find something else, or you just stop studies and find a job for like a couple of years, and then can go back to universities. It's always hard, like for the people that have the less money to begin with.
Do you agree with Alexandre that there is an improvement in France?
Yeah, there is an improvement, but the main question when I hear all the speakers tonight is why we are going to the university now. It's because we say that going to the university is helping you in the life for the future. So which future we want for your youth, for young people, and we see that at the end of the university, maybe you have difficulty to find job, difficulty to live also. So it's more a systemic problem of helping people to have a good education and get access to grandes écoles or even university, have a nice job in a nice place. So that's why I think decentralization it's a key issue. Maybe to when you have your education in a city, you want to stay there to have a family project and maybe have a nice job and try to be free. That's the aim of university.
Florent Berthaud, I want your reaction to a survey that was done. The number of French students with financial difficulties below the European average, according to a study conducted by the same body that runs Erasmus, the student exchange programs throughout the EU. And you can see on this average, Germany has a higher problem. You heard earlier Andy Green saying somewhere between 30% and maybe 1/3 of students who come out of UK universities are going to have trouble. But when you look at this, France being below the EU average of students with difficulties, what's your reaction?
I say that we need to be very careful with figures because we are talking about people. So each case is different. Maybe we are below the average, European average, and that's maybe a good point, but we need to work on this 23% of people in difficulties. So we need to create more links between students, professors, and maybe the states. We need to give more information to students to be helped also, because we are not a lot of association and public structure that wants to help students, but maybe they don't have the information. So we need to be very careful, and maybe we can work also on how we give the grants. So we need to help students to have the information of the grants, but maybe we can help more the students in bigger difficulties. So maybe change the social curve on how we distribute the grants, because we see on the figures, if I'm right, half of students in France do have access to a grant. So maybe we can create a new categories of access to grants and higher grants for some people, some students.
Alexandre Remy?
One person cannot do the entire job. I'm going to give you a concrete example of something we had to face a few days ago. A student came from a country far away from France with his suitcases and nowhere to stay. And he came to us and told us, well, I'm here now. I'm going to start my second year master's next week. What can you do for me? And we were saying, well, today we can't do anything for you because you don't fit the criteria, because you have to be in the system, so you have to fit a certain criteria, but you will in the next couple months. So we picked up the phone, called the school he was studying at, and told them, well, this is the case. We're going to help him, but it's going to take a couple of months. Can you do something in the meantime? And they went through their files. They have emergency funds as well, so they they said, well, we're going to take care of him for the next 2 months because we can, and then you'll take over and fix the situation. So if everybody in the chain of reaction does a little bit of what's necessary, we can find solution like for the entire school year for somebody, including somebody that has no family, no resources, no nothing.
And what's the calculus when it comes to those foreign students?
They're increasing. And that's part of the international competition between universities and engineering school and all. It's part of the equation now. So if you want to be high ranking in Shanghai and whatnot, you need to have international students and come here.
When you recruit those foreign students, are you recruiting the best of the best and therefore fueling a bit that brain drain?
Obviously, if you want to be the best, you need to have like good researchers, and a good researcher needs to publish a lot, so you need to attract the greatest minds. So no matter if they're rich or poor, as long as they're the greatest minds, they're going to be invited to come. So we need to find a way for those. And they're increasing. Every year, the number of international students increases in France. And so if they come and they have the same problems that our national students have, well, we have twice more to do to find solutions for everyone.
Andy Green, when I visited St. Andrews University a few years back, it's a gorgeous campus. It's a great university. And I heard a lot of American accents there. And it's what you were saying earlier about the higher tuition fees. Are they bringing those American students because they're good or because, well, they help fill the coffers?
I can't speak for the Scottish universities. I think they have a slightly different system of fee charging. But it's definitely true in the English universities that increasingly we rely on the fees from international students, which are very high. And I think the proportion of international, well, we're absolutely reliant on them for the university income. So, and, you know, they don't always get the best of deals. They're paying very high fees, and they're also having to pay very high rents if they're living in London. It's true, as one of your contributors said, that in the first year, students tend to live on campus. The rents are going up in campus accommodation as well. But of course, for the rest of the time, they may be living in market accommodation outside the university, and they're paying very high fees, very high rents in the big cities. So life can be extremely tough for international students.
And is it a good thing that we're having more of these international students?
Well, I think so. I think culturally it's a good thing. I think it's good for the economy, and we're now reversing the earlier laws which stopped them staying on afterwards, so they can remain for a while in Britain to fill gaps in the labour market and so on. So, I mean, there are definitely benefits in the UK from having this kind of flow of talent coming through from international students in the university, and it's a great benefit to the cultural life of the university. So I don't think there's any doubt about that. I don't think anybody wants to reduce their numbers, but they do have to be given value for money and get decent services. And on the accommodation front, there are serious problems. The rents are too high, and in fact, I would say for young people in general, it's housing which is the biggest issue. It's just become unaffordable for young people in the big cities, whether you're renting in the private market or if you're trying to buy a house. And fewer and fewer people under 30 now are able to buy houses. They're getting locked out of the housing market. So, you know, the students, when they graduate and they go off to work, they're looking and they're still hoping to be able to buy a house at some point. And the proportion now that do so it has reduced probably by half since the previous generation.
There seems to be
the baby boomer generation.
There seems to be this common thread, Titouan Martin Barré. A year ago, when the Yellow Vest movement sprang up, it was resentment of the fact that it's too expensive to live in town, so people move further and further away, and they find themselves in isolated communities. Part of what was the phenomenon there. With the students, same thing. They're being squeezed out just by rent prices.
Yeah, totally. Rent is a big issue for students. We usually have big problems, and our volunteers everywhere on the local, everywhere in France, usually like do some like helping around. Like they get someone and like, can I sleep on your couch? Okay, sure, we'll find a couch for you to sleep in 1 month, 2 months. The time to find like a place. So we've got like big renting problem, and the rent are going up even on the social rent, and even in the cruise rents are going up. Hopefully it'll stop in a couple of days, because we were asking the government that even though they say rent is not going to raise anymore, it's not going to be enough, because if I can react to a couple of things that were said, there is a solution, I agree. There is a lack of information, I agree. But the biggest problem is lack of money invested in the right place, because government wants to invest money in youth. Apparently, there's like the Service National Universel, but it's really not the right place at the moment to invest such big amounts of money in such some...
Like a scheme like the civic service, you don't think that that's...
Well, yeah, basically it's really like a huge waste of money when money is needed somewhere else to stop. Like,
and is rent a priority, the way you heard it described there by Andy Green? Is that the number one priority for you?
I'd say it's the number 2 priority, because the number 1 priority will be like reform the welfare system like really fast, and it's going to help the renting problem, probably.
Alexandre?
Maybe 2 answers to that. The first is this year scholarships were increased by a total of 46 million euros, which is not enough to catch up for the last 3 years, but it's an effort that's already made. And the second thing is there's a lot of development of public housing, which is roughly 30 to 40% cheaper than rent in the private sector. So if we manage to build more student accommodation in the public sector, we also level down the prices in big cities, which is something that happened in Bordeaux 10 years ago. There was a lot of private housing. We started building lots and lots and lots of public housing in Bordeaux, and prices went down for students. And prices went down in a time span of 5 years. Prices went down considerably. And today, including investors, try to make sure that the prices are at the lowest level, which is the public level, to make sure that their apartments are rented easily. So we need to do the same in other big cities like Lyon, like Marseille, like Paris probably. And this is a trend that should be followed in the next few years.
So this is on a city-by-city basis at this point. On a city-by-city basis, what do you do in the short term, Florian Berco?
Maybe we can innovate and find new solution of housing, because you can, for example, share the housing to create more social links, also to avoid isolation of people, to be alone, so the loneliness. Sorry. So maybe we can imagine all together the state, unions, private companies work together on other way of giving housing for students. So we can mix public funds, private funds, and try to host in other way.
Because there are municipal elections coming up in the spring. Is that something that people are thinking about? How do we make our town, our city, attractive to students?
Yeah, I think so. I'm candidate in Laval, in one of the city
in the west of France.
West of France, so a small city, but need to attract some students also, and need to attract universities. For example, we have university in law, 1 year for medicine, but we need now the other years to maybe form medicines and médecins. So it's an opportunity for this city to host more students, attract them, and host them well with good conditions. So yeah, it's an issue.
All right, housing perhaps one of the issues that's at the crux of it. I want to thank you so much for joining us, Florent Berco. I want to thank Alexandre Miss as well. Titouan Martin Barry, good luck with your studies. And I want to thank as well Andy Green for being with us from Oxford. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois. So the hashtag étudiants en colère, or students in anger, has been gathering some of the comments today accompanying the demonstrations. So just to take a look at some of the comments online. The boss of LVMH, Bernard Arnault, is being mentioned in one comment. His personal fortune is now 100 billion euros. So that is being used as a kind of a point of contrast with the somewhat more meagre sum that students have to deal with on a monthly basis. A monthly allowance of 550 euros, which in Paris is basically half of what you need to get by. So that's one comment coming through. Others pointing out this is Décidons Paris, which is a group for the local elections next year. 1 student out of 5 is living below the poverty line, and only 1 student housing allotted per 4 students who have a student allowance. So again, pointing out the fact that there's a degree of precariousness, poverty. Other comments under the hashtag here. This is a comment in English pointing to the self-immolation that took place in Lyon a couple of weeks back. That this person saying that why isn't there more discussion of this? This is really shocking. The media haven't been covering it, which isn't true because it did get a certain amount of coverage, but perhaps not the wall-to-wall coverage that Twitter user would have liked. And in fact, today in Lyon, there were students who marched towards the student housing, or CRUS in Lyon, where this immolation took place. So certainly that was one incident that sort of was a lightning rod for feelings of discontent about the standard of living of students. So just a lot of messages of support coming through as well. Total support, says this academic, for students who are gathering today against poverty. And this basically talking as well, looking towards the 5th of December when there's going to be a general strike here in France. So that's another comment coming through. So yeah, that's basically just a look at some of the comments that there were today onto that hashtag.
Because for those who follow French politics closely, a lot of people are looking ahead to those December 5th strike day. Do they get the sense that the president, the students that 1 year on, I suppose it depends who you talk to, but do they get the sense the president is more aware of what are the needs of people who don't have a lot?
It looks like the president and the government are willing to listen to us. We don't know if it's going to hear us, because that's the major problem. Usually government is like, okay, so yeah, we understand what you're saying, but we don't do anything about it. And basically it is the main problem. And these tweets like are a common thing, and these are numbers. But when we are in the field, we realize how precarious some students are, which is really awful to see and to live sometimes.
And in fact, examples of that are coming through as well in some of the press coverage. This is some witness statements to Le Monde. Studying and living with 100 euros a month, you need a huge amount of organisation. That's the reality of some people in terms of disposable income they have. I rarely go out, says this person who seems to be anonymous. I never buy new clothes. I just eat pasta. So you have the picture of a life of extreme, I suppose, poverty, really. And this is another statement online saying, when my mother asks me what I've eaten, I invent a meal. So there's a degree of hidden poverty as well, or poverty that's been kind of swept under the rugs because of the shame, I suppose, that people feel. So certainly, despite the fact that France might be in a better position than a lot of other countries, there's some pretty shocking stories coming through today.
All right, indeed. Many thanks for that, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.